I'd like to welcome everyone to the Visiting Artist Program Lecture Series. It's so nice to see you guys here. I'm so happy to be back in person. Thank you for joining us. I'm Taylor. I'm one of the Visiting Artist Program coordinators. And we have two other members of the VAP team, McKenna and Lasha. I believe Lasha is outside bringing you guys in, so you can meet her later. The Visiting Artist Program is funded by PAFA's graduate program, and it brings an outstanding roster of local, national, and international artists to PAFA each semester for lectures, critiques, and workshops. The program exposes students and the public to a range of artistic approaches and fosters discussion about contemporary art and ideas, and this afternoon we are so pleased to have Dawn Kramlich joining us. Thank you, Dawn. Dawn Kramlich is a Texas-born artist and writer living and working in Philadelphia. Her work examines systems of power in language through the disciplines of painting and poetry amid a lens of queer studies and intersectional feminism. Kramlich earned her BA from Muhlenberg College, producing the first cross-major creative honors thesis of akphrastic painting and poem pairs in the history of Muhlenberg's English and Arts Department. While at Muhlenberg, Kramlich became a member of the Phi Beta Kappa National Honor Society, and she graduated magna cum laude with honors. Wow, that's awesome.
Thank you.
She then moved to Philadelphia and earned her MFA in studio art from Moore College of Art and Design, culminating in an art installation and written thesis titled Palimpsestual Responses: The Limits of Language in Contemporary Society. Kramlich has shown her work widely in the U.S. and internationally in Ireland. Most notably, her work was included in Maus Contemporary Capitalism, the Normalization of Political Violence in the United States exhibition in 2021, Rowan University's gallery exhibition entitled Dialogic alongside John Giorno, Kwame Palencia, Jenny Holzer, and Glenn Ligon in 2013. In the four-person installation-based exhibition entitled Paperscapes at Philadelphia Art Alliance in 2017, and in the three-person exhibition titled Beyond the Scene at the Mainline Art Center in 2018. Her work has been published in Muhlenberg Museum, CODA Magazine, The Magazine, and the online version of Creative Quarterly. So let's give a warm welcome to Dawn. Thank you.
Hello. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge and recognize that the land this renowned arts institution functions upon is that of the Lenape people, whom endured and still endure many injustices over the centuries that the USA has existed. With humility, I am aware that the many art and academic institutions that have benefited my career, artistically and teaching-wise, are in existence as a part of the machination that is colonization. With respect and honor, I teach myself in an effort to do better than my predecessors. I'm grateful to be here today, owning all of my queer womanhood. And it is my pleasure to have been selected by the students of PAFA as an artist they want to hear and learn from. There's no greater honor, in my humble opinion. This will be a talk about how I got from this work over here to that work. When discussing career trajectory with students, I find that humanizing the process of artistic evolution helps. So I will engage with the overarching theoretical development of my work over the last decade in all of its winding, imperfect, but interrelated nuances. After all, any seemingly immense impact of any given artist's work is a process of years of trial and error, happening in a series of spurts, a sequence of moments, and lots of false starts. The question I get most often is, why text? And the beginning of the answer to that question lies in a commonly shared experience. So, if you could entertain me for a moment, raise your hand if you've ever sent a text message and had the receiver of that text react far differently than you assumed because of lack of tone. Look around, right? Like literally everyone is raising their hands. So for me, this might be a text to my sister, very genuinely saying something like, "You're such a great mom." But if she's had a shit day with her kids, she's gonna be like, "Your sarcasm isn't helpful," right? We've all been there. So that gap in language is one of the things that I'm very invested in. This gap of intention versus reception is not a new problem. Historically, we've faced it multiple times in the evolution of communication modes, but it's certainly the case that computer-mediated communication is the next iteration of it. When I began this body of work that I'm going to discuss first, my awareness of anxiety levels rising among myself and my peers fed my interest in understanding how our shifting relationship to language and to each other through language may be a culprit. With emails, texts, AOL Instant Messenger, if anyone back there remembers it, followed by Facebook, Instagram, meme culture, Snapchat, etc., it became more and more imperative to me that I assess these gaps in language from my vantage point as what I like to call a millennial light. The portion of the millennial generation that I fall within is the only portion of any generation that possibly grew up both with and without the internet. I didn't have a computer in my home until 8th grade, when it was becoming normalized that the average privileged home had one. Those in a similar position to mine have the lived experience of an internalized idea of the cultural shift that happened due to communication and interpersonal relations. To me, it's both the death and theater of language. The theater of immediacy and ease of communicating, but also the death of something inevitably lost in translation, whether through Google Translate of a website or the translation from human to machine to human. This work is an example of my thinking through the intention versus reception dilemma through the lens of Roland Barthes' Death of the Author essay. When any given person reads a text, whether a book or a text message, their subjective writes that text anew. The speaker drops out in the mind and perception of the receiver. So in this work, the ice spells the word you, and as it melts, me appears behind it in clear acrylic, floating in the negative space of the stage. The phrase comprising the sides are various iterations of I have changed you have changed me, I have changed me, and you have changed you. The gaps in language are inevitable. It's the nature of our human brains making sense of our world. To name is to claim, and I will claim something differently than you will. If I say a word as simple as apple, for example, I'm thinking of the Granny Smith apples that my grandmother cut up for me when I was a child. But you could be thinking of a Macintosh or even a Steve Jobs machine. Thus enter semiotics, the study of signs and symbols in a given culture. Here I used text and negative space as a metaphor for the gaps in any given communication. The portions of our nuanced intention getting lost in the receivership of the words. These gaps could be because of trauma influencing our ability to receive certain words, or they could be the result of loss of tone of voice in a text message. But regardless of what the stakes are, they are inevitable and frustrating and beautiful, and it is the core of the human need for art and art making and expression. The prototype of this, which you just saw, was done while I was in an artist residency in Ireland. And I completed the work using a laser cutting machine when I got back to the States. Learning to use the laser cutting machine was the best move I could have made, thanks to my mentors at the time, Martha Gillardin and Paul Hubbard, for their encouragement, of course. Because it allowed me to more precisely connect my theoretical approach to the work's aesthetic. At the time, as an MFA student, sorry about that. Here we go. At the time, as an MFA student, one of the negative critiques I received most often was, why not just use a font? And thankfully, I had found the gumption to stand by my decision to hand draw the text, cut it out with an X-Acto knife, scan it, and then employ the laser cutting machine to replicate the work of my hand. This tedious but nuanced methodology allowed the work to embody the idea of the human behind the machine. In text messages, Facebook comments, Instagram DMs, it's so easy to ignore the need to take ownership of the impact of one's words. But in a world where language is power, with echo chambers online emboldening bigots, it's imperative that we maintain this skill. There's always a human on the other side of that screen. And just because we can't witness their reaction, they are having one. The text in this work reads, "You are too sensitive." A phrase I have heard throughout my life as a woman, unafraid of expressing emotions outside of the patriarchy's allowable anger. So students, a tidbit from me to you. Find your gumption and hold on to it. You've probably noticed my repeated use of this word. I promise I didn't make it up. Merriam-Webster Dictionary can show us as much. Palimpsest originally described an early form of recycling in which a document, right, was erased to make room for a new one when parchment was a limited resource. This recycling resulted in tidbits of many texts hinting at their existence due to imperfect erasures. Nowadays, the word palimpsest can refer to not only such a document, but to anything multiply stratified. After reading Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows, I realized that our minds are becoming palimpsests of barely recallable facts. We know something, but we have to look it up on Google to remind ourselves of the details. Right? I think that's a pretty relatable experience as well. Carr refers to this as seeking breadth over depth. With our 25 open tabs and our constant notifications, we deepen those neurological pathways that seek breadth, training our brains to seek immediacy both on and off the internet. Consequentially, losing patience with our communication. And as we now know, social media is an addiction. And if you aren't sure about that statement, I will challenge you to go watch the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, if you haven't already. Our gadgets have become our appendages. Google searches are our memory recall. This is both good and bad. RAM, or random access memory, is the computer's manner of multitasking. And our palimpsest minds try and fail at mimicking this. A large portion of the conversation surrounding our shifting use of and relationship to language has to do with the fact that our tech has always evolved faster than we do as humans. Our ability to navigate interpersonal relations hangs in that limbo. A solipsist is one who subscribes to the theory that only the self can be proved to exist. This philosophical notion felt like an apt comparison to the loneliness of communication via screens instead of in real life. And certainly it's the case that learning and teaching during COVID quarantine gave us a lived extreme of this. When you approach this specific installation, to enter its space, you are confronted with your silhouette. When inside of it, there's nowhere that you can stand, which will block out all of the text shadows. The text, depending on what phrase you see first, is the one I've used before. It can be read as, I have changed you, you have changed me, I have changed me, and you have changed you. As cognitive scientist Lyra Broditsky states in her TED Talk, quote, "The language we speak shapes the way we think. A given language can open up entire cognitive realms depending on how it's culturally structured." Right? So in English, it's completely normative to say something like, "I broke my arm." But if you translate that directly to many other languages, they will look at you like you're a lunatic who actively sought out to go break their own arm. So if the internet is changing our relationship to language, and language shapes the way we think, through transitive logic, one could assert that the internet is changing how we think, which Carr shows us in his book, The Shallows. In this installation, I chose to only use projector light to achieve the specific bluish light that screens emit. It was also a conscious choice to only use black matte board and no other color. Just as language shapes the way we think, our cultural semiotic system also does. I'll give you another example. I was being my nerdy self, playing board games with 4 friends, 2 of whom were born and raised in the US, and 2 of whom were born and raised in India. And we were, chit-chatting, shooting the shit, if you will, talking about our everyday lives, and they asked, "Dawn, what are you teaching this week?" And I said, "Oh, I'm teaching about color," and they asked for details. And so I said, "Okay, well, I'll ask y'all what I ask my students. What do you think of when I say the word red?" And my 2 friends who were born and raised in the US immediately said blood, fire, and violence. But my 2 friends who were born and raised in India said passion and love. If I choose to make the word you, for example, in green, and the word me in red, the implications presented to the viewer in this work would change dramatically. Not wanting to direct the emotional implications of the words too much, I was left with achromatics, white as the reflection of all wavelengths of light, and acknowledging that that has problematic white male patriarchal notions of purity, as well as anxiety due to the idea of erasure or soiling said purity. Sculptor Louise Nevelson once asserted that black, as the absorption of all wavelengths of light, is a totality. It holds all possibilities within it for the viewer to read. The last main theoretical piece of this body of work arrived with my understanding of Michel Foucault's idea of a heterotopia. It describes places and spaces that function in non-hegemonic conditions. In other words, these are spaces of otherness, which are neither here nor there, that are simultaneously physical and mental. And when I read this theory, I made the realization that the internet cleaves our existence into a heterotopia. We are neither here nor there when we lose several hours doom scrolling on social media. We are not thinking about where our feet are physically rooted in real life when we're mentally invested in the space of the internet. another story for you. My former roommate, for example, and I hope she forgives me for telling this story. She once ran straight into a lamppost because she was texting. She needed stitches over her eyebrow because she was invested in the headspace of her screen instead of the empirical space of the sidewalk she was on. And I promise she can laugh about it now with me. So there are moments, right, where we lose track of our physical reality when we are in the headspace of the internet, so we are neither here nor there. And Catherine Hales similarly calls for a distinction between materiality and physicality. In her book, My Mother Was a Computer, pun intended. Pixels, like spoken language, are material, but they are not physical in a tangible sense. Thus, my material is language, but my physical medium here is hand-drawn laser-cut matboard. For this installation, which changes with site specificity and grows with more components every time I install it, I used a phrase that my father often said to me when I was a child: forever and ever, no matter what. And while I have taken this out of context to make it ambiguous enough to leave room for my theoretical approach and the viewer, this phrase is simultaneously very personal to me and very conceptual. I ask myself, what if language was made tangible like mold, or an ant colony growing like a nuisance? After all, language is a living, breathing, mutable entity that changes with every community that uses it. Colloquialisms get added to dictionaries. Words gain multiple meanings with cultural shifts. Phrases are popularized and then appropriated. The phrase forever and ever, no matter what, gets reconfigured in this work many times over, and an investigative viewer can glean stratified poetic meaning from combinations such as forever, no matter what, no matter, and ever, or maybe just no. Language, like change, is one constant we can depend on. In all of its beauty, in all of its fallibility, its inevitable gaps, and its ability to draw us close. This installation creeps up the wall like if language were a tangible object, like an idea taking hold, slowly growing, seizing space. Before I demonstrate the more recent developments of my work, I want to return to the ever-present question I've mentioned before: why text? Investigating the text and image relationship in art is important because it is far more normative now than ever to consciously think in metaphor numerous times on a daily basis. Thinking in metaphor, of course, has always been a useful tool, applied by artists of all disciplines and cultures since humans evolved the ability to philosophize and communicate about their existence. Now, however, the daily life of someone who has access to the internet and partakes in any form of news or social media includes constantly analyzing a complex semiotic system of text and image in memes and video clips. This imperative analysis of the text and image and text as image relationship is necessary because few things are as powerful and political as language. I had the pleasure of being curated into a 3-person show at the Mainline Arts Center in 2018, and the curator wanted to include this work, which was from 2013. During our reception artist talk, I had an audience member ask me if this work was in reference to the #MeToo movement. That was nowhere in my mind while making it in 2013, but it's a very valid point about the work, because #MeToo. For me, this was a really revealing example of Roland Barthes' theory of the death of the author. Upon receivership by a new viewer, within a shifting US cultural milieu, my work was written anew in her mind, as all artwork is due to the nature of the human subjective. But even more so, the text, I have changed you, you have changed me, etc., took on entirely different meaning within a 2018 context as opposed to a 2013 one. As a result, I began to really take stock in a more political approach to my work. Why the hell was I using mostly heteronormative males to frame my conceptual approach? What was the actual impact of my work if I was attempting to be somehow neutrally, air quotes, very necessary, neutrally conceptual? Let's also acknowledge that from 2015 to 2018, I personally was incredibly unhappy with the vast majority of the work I was making. I just haven't put it in a slideshow. Students, you will make bad work. Every artist does. Do it. Then put it away, trust the process. Know that it's leading you somewhere because you are intelligent, committed, and capable. Those 3 years when I made terrible art were spent mastering encaustic as a medium. They were spent feeling the solidarity of Tarana Burke's #MeToo movement, pride parades, and finally embracing my full self and coming out. It may have been a dark time for my portfolio, but it was a necessary time for my artistic growth. This painting from 2019 was the first work in quite a long time that I felt like I had arrived at a new substantive aesthetic. I began exclusively using a phrase that a man said to me in a work context, quote, "Your value to us diminishes." To me, this phrase requests the viewer to think about what role they take when reading the painting. As speaker or receiver of the text, or an omniscient bystander to it, your relationship to the white heteronormative male patriarchal order from whence the phrase often comes is presented within its smokescreen. I felt I had finally arrived at a way to paint an ekphrastic, palimpsest-like combination of text as and within an image. The smokescreen became increasingly pertinent to my practice. As queers like me and other non-bigots of this country analyzed and endured the white lash that was Trump's election in 4 years. White lash, a term originally coined by journalist John H. Britton Jr., is the backlash of white people against the economic advancement of marginalized groups, especially when racially motivated. The text in the background of this work reads, "Glass ceiling, glass walls, glass house." And the phrase, "value diminishes us," capital US intended, is the only text made in negative space within the smokescreen. It is loaded to make this house white. It is whiteness. It is unstable. It diminishes us, and capital US. Now, you've heard me use the term ekphrasis at least more than once now, so I'd like to take a moment to dig into that a bit further for clarity's sake. Traditionally, an extensively detailed passage describing an object within a text or epic poem is an ekphrasis. The study of ekphrasis dates all the way back to the ancient Roman poet Horace, who wrote Ut pictura poesis. As is painting, so is poetry. The idea that the two are inherently linked, dependent upon one another, akin in more ways than not. Much more recently than ancient Rome, scholars began discussing ekphrasis as a translation from one medium to another. From the medium of stone to the medium of words, for example, if the poet is depicting a stone sculpture through words. Ekphrasis is not illustration. It's not captions, but it's a complex semiotic system. And after all, as Hal Foster said of the postmodernists, artists are manipulators of signs. Most problematic to me within the tradition of ekphrasis, however, was the white male heteronormative patriarchal tendency to claim that images or paintings are silent and still, and therefore somehow feminine. And poetic text was active and masculine. This inappropriately gendered alignment disengages with the fact that images can be read slow or fast, just as text. An artist, like a poet, can control the activity of the viewer with strategically compelling or resisting material. My first influence was William Blake. He's the just pre-Romantic era poet who incorporated ekphrastic images alongside his poetic texts in etched pleats. My appreciation for his work turned me on to all things text and image, but his work's content has nothing to do with my work's content. Barbara Kruger has created many works that are ekphrastic in their complex relationship between text and image. Her exploration of the female perspective and experience, especially within her work from the 80s, helped me understand how to oppose the male gaze. I'm incredibly influenced by artists like Mark Bradford and Julie Muratu, whose work is simply queer because they are. Bradford's merchant posters changed my entire outlook of what text-based art could be, and Muratu's manner of creating imagery, palimpsests, is completely unmatched, in my opinion, by anyone else. Countless marginalized friends, or generally emotionally intelligent people in my community, have told me that the phrase, "you are too sensitive," resonates with them. So many of us women and queers especially have been told this. I returned to this phrase after many years and made a palimpsest of it, which feels confined and confining simultaneously. The text is painted to be both dense and a smokescreen. It's concrete and ephemeral. It has impact as it feels both permanent and impermanent. Perhaps it's a conversation or an internal debate. This all too common language as power tool of toxic male patriarchal culture is usually uttered, "you are too sensitive," when the person saying it cannot endure or process an emotional circumstance they're faced with. Perhaps the revealing of this embedded paradox takes away some of its power while dramatically confronting the viewer. I made this work in February 2020 for anyone who dares to say what they mean and mean what they say in a context that tries to silence them. Students, your third tidbit, your voice matters. Be bold among the smokescreen. Be audible when everything and/or everyone tells you not to be. Enforce your audacity. The necessity of the term intersectionality has come into focus over the last decade, more so than the two prior, especially in terms of intersectional feminism. But not everyone acknowledges its true origins in Kimberly Crenshaw's 1989 paper, From a Legal Perspective. She's in the law department at University of Chicago, or she was when she wrote it. In demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex, Crenshaw argues for a legal precedent to account for how Black women are doubly impacted by their sex and their race. In the process of doing so, she used a metaphor that makes it clear how the layers of one's identity impact their status in society. So, imagine this with me. In her essay, she imagines a basement in which those who face injustices by three identities, queerness, race, and sex, for example, are standing on the floor. Those who face injustices by two identities rather than three stand on their shoulders, and those facing one injustice identity stand on their shoulders, creating a ladder of humans attempting to get onto the first floor of the building. Those on the top of this three-tier body ladder have the status of what Crenshaw calls, if it weren't for my. If it weren't for my being a woman, I could be on the first floor. So I will crawl up through the vent. Alas, I'm also queer. Trans Black women face the most injustice. After attending some still incredibly imperative Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020, I made this work. The background text is quieted by the smokescreen of language in the foreground, which reads, "Useless conjecture." Language of the oppressor. It also appears like burning trees. It also appears like a crowd covered by militaristic lines. America in 2020 was so insufficient for all of us. For frontline workers, for child caretakers, for teachers, students, those in blue-collar jobs that keep our society afloat. The smokescreen thins in this work, the veil peels back, the crowd pushes onward. And this body of work is still evolving to this day, alongside another body of work that I also began in 2020. During the true quarantine of 2020, I was in my very tiny studio apartment instead of my art studio, which is hilariously bigger than my apartment. I was too scared of COVID to go to my studio. So I brought these little tiny panels, and they sat there for a while. So I read instead, and one of those books was Rebecca Solnit's Men Explain Things to Me. In it, she writes of a phrase that made me realize that the whole point of my using the phrase, quote, "your value to us diminishes," was an American relationship to the word value. Solnit's phrase is the tyranny of the quantifiable. And I will read a brief passage from this book since her verbiage is so precise. Solnit says, quote, "My friendship ward speaks of the tyranny of the quantifiable, of the way what can be measured almost always takes precedence over what cannot. Private profit over public good, speed and efficiency over enjoyment and quality. The utilitarian over the mysteries and meanings that are of greater use to our survival, and to more than our survival, to lives that have some purpose and value that survive beyond us, to make a civilization worth happening. The tyranny of the quantifiable is partly the failure of language and discourse to describe more complex, subtle, and fluid phenomena, as well as the failure of those who shape opinions and make decisions to understand and value these slipperier things. It is difficult sometimes, even impossible, to value what we cannot name or describe. And so the task of naming and describing is an essential one in any revolt against the status quo of capitalism and consumerism. Thus began my Capitalist Plaid series, as I scrutinized and audited my own white, woman, queer relationship to the word value. I paired each painting with poetic text that I wrote to complicate the context and function as an ekphrastic loop of sorts. In these tiny acrylic works, I began using a minimalist aesthetic as a symbol for systems at play in our society. The word value refers to variations of such polarized attributes as hues versus achromatics. It conjures incredibly disparate imagery serving as signifiers, and it can be humanistic, economic, or materialistic in its usage. When coupled with a grid, actual or implied, disrupted or not, it suggests a system. Language is a political system. Art is also a political system, and as Rosalind Krauss wrote, originality of what was known as the avant-garde was in fact a paradox. The grid is not an origin of some aesthetic purity, as many modernist writers would have had us believe. It is simply a reflection and reification of the structure of the canvas, the order. When we consider Krauss's assertion in context with Eva Hesse's notion that minimalism was simply a metaphor for the confinement of society, what we come to understand is that the grid, in one of many functions, serves strongly as an American art historical symbol for capitalism and the system of the white, male, heteronormative, patriarchal order. So I began repurposing the grid, using it against itself. Influenced somewhat by Catherine Opie here, I turned the grid system into a scab of whiteness that reappears after one's attempt to reconfigure oneself. I begin the acrylic works with a layer of the word value, then a layer of gesso muting it, then another layer of the word, and another layer of gesso, and so on. The top, broken layer of intersecting moments has more saturation, but is forced to follow or snap to the grid. I then played around with the transparency of encaustic rather than acrylics. Desaturated over time, a capitalist plaid, mimicking, reflecting, echoes. The system locks, a long, pale shadow. The last three works I'm going to show you are my most recent. They sort of fuse the previous two series, bringing their aesthetic and conceptual approach a bit closer. I'm really excited about where I'm headed with this. In my studio, I mean, of course. Here I'm pulling from two of my favorite poets, considering their words in context with the fact that they were each, more than likely, at least bisexual, if not gay. That's Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. I contain multitudes, Whitman said. Forever is composed of nows, is from a Dickinson poem. One can contain multitudes, even if society's order tells them to mute it. This work, which I am incredibly honored to say, will be up at the Philadelphia International Airport for a year, starting in October, is another refusal to be contained. Resist and persist. Step out of line. Push through the grid. A painting, like a woman, is not silent and is not still. I will not contain myself for anyone but me. I push to the forefront, despite the systematic order of the white, male, heteronormative patriarchy.
We would love to take questions from you guys at this time, so feel free to raise your hand or shout anything out. Don't be shy.
I do have a question.
Sure.
Is there like a reason you do all of your picture planes in like the portrait?
I never thought about that. Thank you for pointing that out to me. I think I just am drawn to that proportion because it now that I'm considering it for the first time ever, because it's the way a page is typically oriented, at least for our culture here in America. Yeah, I'll have to think more on that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tell me more about the word encaustic.
Encaustic.
Yes.
So encaustic is a medium of beeswax and resin. Resin raises the melting temperature. And then the pigment obviously gives it the color. And you paint with it in its molten state. Have a couple burn scars to prove it. Whoops, 2 in 8 years is not a bad track record. But what kind of detail do you want in reference to?
That was great.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And it actually dates back to the ancient Egyptians, which a lot of people don't know. And if anyone knows Jasper Johns, he utilized encaustic quite a bit. Not on panels, which is why he is known as a conservator's nightmare.
Okay, I asked the wrong question.
Yes.
I'm talking not about encaustic, but ecstatic.
Oh, ekphrasis.
Yes.
Yes, so that is a specific type of poem. So, like I said in my talk, traditionally it was, if you imagine like the Iliad, right? Any passage where the poet is focused solely on describing one object, that's an ekphrasis section. But nowadays, you can have a piece of music written as an ekphrasis of a poem, right? And so there are many examples of this. One example of this notion of ekphrasis as translation from one medium to another that like a lot of people are aware of is John Keats's poem Ode to a Grecian Urn, which he's literally recreating the Greek urn in the medium of words. Does that answer fully? Great. Yes?
Could you talk about the influence that Julie Monato had on your art?
Yes, absolutely. I really deeply conceptually appreciate how her careful curation of image choices becomes a metaphor for a community or society in general. But aesthetically, she maintains order within chaos in a way that, like I said, I think is completely unmatched by anyone. So to me, her works are very much palimpsestual, which is why I think I'm drawn to them. And the more you sit with it, the more layers of that stratification come through. So it's just a deep appreciation. Yes?
Do you think you'll move back to the three-dimensional work? And do you miss the light is used in that?
I think one of the reasons I'm so drawn to encaustic is because light passes through it so well, and because it serves as a perfect fusion for me personally between my painterly and my sculptural tendencies. Because I don't use encaustic traditionally the way that like most people do. I dig into it with clay tools and I create inlay scenarios. And so I think there is still a little hint of my sculptural practice in the work. But I absolutely have ideas of three-dimensional encaustic works consistently mulling over in my brain. I just don't think my practice is quite at the point of realizing them yet. Thank you for that question. Yes?
What is the relevance of color in your most recent movie?
Yeah, great question. So I explained how the grid, right, debunked by Rosalind Krauss, is now used by me as a symbol, right, of a system and a structure that I'm speaking against, but also confined within. And so I've been playing around with color in that manner, acknowledging that the aesthetic tradition of, quote, purity would lead you to primary colors, right? Because those are the ones that create the rest of them. So I'm playing with secondary colors purposely as an in-betweenness. Thank you. Any additional questions?
Questions? Comments?
Yes, comments are more than welcome, please. Go for it.
Yeah, I got here kind of late. Where do you teach at?
Oh, sorry, I didn't mention. I teach at Penn State's Abington campus, and I also teach at Muhlenberg College. I've been an adjunct for 8 years. Hopefully going to get a tenure track position at some point, but we'll see. And I saw a hand over here.
I've enjoyed your use of the language. Have
Thank you.
Considered writing?
I often joke that I make paintings because I'm envious of poets. And that's just my imposter syndrome hesitation to put the pen to the page. But especially at the start of COVID quarantine, the wheels started turning again. So I'm headed there.
Good,
Not quite there yet.
good.
But thank you so much. That's one of the best comments I could have received. I appreciate that you said I handled the language well. Yes?
Well, can you talk about your undergrad experience?
Mhm.
There was a period between undergrad and grad,
Mm-hmm.
and how long was that?
Yes. So in undergrad, which I actually went to Muhlenberg College, that was when I studied ekphrasis. And then I took 2 gap years before I went to get my MFA at Moore College of Art and Design. And since I had the paintings and poems separate at Muhlenberg with my undergraduate thesis, because like a super nerd fool, I pursued a thesis in both majors, which definitely failed in some ways, but also succeeded in others. I wanted in my MFA to bring the 2 together. And so in the Ireland residency was when that really truly clicked with the work Palimpsest number 3. That was done by hand and then laser cut when I came back.
And would you say that the graduate experience is where a lot of the conceptual readings that inform the work really started to take hold?
I was actually really fortunate that a couple of my professors in my undergraduate experience fostered my desire for criticism and art criticism and theory. And so some of the works that I read in graduate school I had already read in undergrad, but of course I didn't understand them fully. So really I think it was the repeated exposure that helped a lot. And you know, an MFA isn't for everyone, but for me it was definitely necessary to get everything to really like mesh in my brain. Yeah, thank you. Yes?
You mentioned Rebecca Solnit.
Yes.
Nice language, which I also have read and love. Do you have other like essays
That's a great question. Not frequently, but occasionally there's a gem by Jonathan Franzen that I find really intriguing, and it's not the one I'm thinking of is one in which, and of course I'm shit with names, so I apologize, I don't know the title off the top of my head, but I'm an artist for a reason, right? So in his essay that I'm thinking of, it was from a book written somewhere around like 2007-ish, where he was talking about the shift in how we as humans relate to public and private because of the invention of cell phones, right? So that is one that I would highly recommend to people who are interested in Rebecca Solnit. I'm also, it's totally different, but I'm also really, really drawn to Cheryl Strayed. Her book, Tiny Beautiful Things, humanizes a lot of things that we face today, especially as women or queer women. I think those are the two I'm going to stick with for now. Yeah. Well, I appreciate each one of you. Your presence is felt, and I am grateful.
Thank you so much, Dawn.
Thank you.